Very nice.
Very cool. Wine for Real people this time on Zoom. Let's get into it talking about grape processing, grape growing, and not grape growing, winemaking.
Yeah, winemaking.
Viniculture.
Viniculture.
As to be compared with the viticulture, the study of grape growing. So grape processing, we're sharing with you our notes for today. So this is what we're going straight over. You're starting with receiving the grapes. And what you're going to really want to watch out for in these first main parts of the process are keeping oxygen contact to a minimum. And you can do this in a number of ways. You really want to be working with as little oxygen in your vessels as possible. So what a winemaker will likely do is, other than sanitizing, they'll probably pump through some CO2 or SO2 to make sure that the area does not have any oxygen present in it. You are also looking to use sulfur dioxide as an antiseptic, an antioxidant, and as an agent to protect against oxidation, to make sure that you're not inhibiting, or rather you're not allowing or creating an environment for microbial bacteria to grow.
And such a process is called anaerobic winemaking. Moving on, once the grapes make it into the winery, you got to process them. We start with destemming if really needed. A lot of mechanical harvesting already takes the stems off to begin with, but if needed, it is done to reduce the tannin in wine, and the stems actually contribute. They remove the acidity slightly, so they mess with the pH of the final product. After destemming, if that was even required in the first place, we have crushing. Crushing frees the juice from the rest of the grape. Of course, we're trying to be careful to avoid crushing the seeds. There's going to be a reoccurring thing that the seeds come up, that we don't crush them, because they will release bitter oils and tannin that will negatively affect the wine. So crushing allows for the free run juice to just kind of flow. It flows free. It increases our juice yield, and at this point, yeast can start to begin fermentation. Our final note there is that white, rosé, and sparkling wines are generally not crushed.
Let's see. So let's see. We'll move on to the process of cold maturation, and then keep in mind that a lot of these things that we just mentioned, crushing, destemming, going on to cold maceration, aren't necessarily required in the general winemaking process. Cold maturation is a process which allows you to extract more flavor and color from the grape itself, and is done, it implies in the name that it's done cold. It's done cold because it suppresses the yeast from starting alcoholic fermentation. They need to be at a certain temperature to be able to perform fermentation. I believe it's between 5 and 35 degrees Celsius, but I think we'll touch on yeast and yeast temperatures a little later. But a process that is required, pressing. So white wines are generally pressed before fermentation, because you're just fermenting the grape juice, while red wines are pressed after fermentation because you're fermenting with the skins, which is what makes a red wine red and what makes white wine white. So like James said, seeds are generally going to be left undamaged, because if you are having that seed breakage in your fermentation, you're creating the risk for more negative tannins that do not contribute to the positive structure of the wine as a whole. Two ways you can press: you can use a pneumatic press, or you can use a basket press, which is the ones that you'll see with two guys turning a big lever, and it'll slowly have a corkscrew going down, pressing the wine. That's an old school method. I think they still use it in Champagne.
Yes, very commonly is.
Yeah, used in Champagne for that grape trio. You could also have a pneumatic press, which is a more mainstream, I'd say.
Modern approach.
Modern approaches to winemaking. So what does a pneumatic press do, James?
So essentially it's a, I believe it's vertical, which I thought.
No, I believe this one's horizontal.
Horizontal.
And
essentially what it does is that you have like a little inflating tube that blows up like a balloon, and that provides a gentle press of the grapes. Again, we're trying not to break the seeds and whatnot. And the tube has a perforated container around it that allows the grapes to have even more pressure and more surface area with contact with the bubble
per se. Thomas color.
Again, while we're pressing, the liquid between presses is drastically different. So at the beginning of the press, the juice is going to be much different than the juice coming at the end of the press. And as such, winemakers may want to break this off into what's called fractions, and then save those, treat those differently, or save them for blending at the end of the winemaking process.
Mm-hmm. And just a note on this fractioning of wine, you may see some winemakers marketing their wine as free run or free press or first press, something to that effect, which they may be able to charge at a different price point because you might be seeing the juice as more pure and more concentrated since it's that first sort of. It's exactly what it is. It's free run. It's just the first sort of, and maybe I'd say the first. Would you say first and best?
Yeah, purest
Yeah,
of juice.
The purest, and for some winemakers, that's what they're looking for. So we move on into sugar and alcohol, and we'll get into enrichment versus chaptalization. We're going to see a theme of this thing called rectified concentrated grape must, RCGM, come up when we talk about adjusting sugar in the must, which is known as enrichment, since it's a natural grape derivative that we're using to sweeten. And we'll see it come up again when we talk about making dessert and sweet wines. So the difference between enrichment and chaptalization, like I said, enrichment involves, I believe it's a specific involvement of grape-related sugar concentrations being added back into the wine, whereas chaptalization is the use of something non-grape related. So like sugar beets or I guess cane sugar or something to that effect.
Enrichment is a process that's done to wine to correct if there isn't enough balance within the wine. You need to increase alcoholic fermentation. So it should be done before alcoholic fermentation for better integration into the wine. And it's often done in cooler climates where grapes do not have enough sugar to achieve desirable alcoholic levels. As such, it is strictly controlled where it is permitted, and the wine may fall out of balance due to these artificial alcohol levels. This can also be done by removing the water from the juice. And when you remove the water from the juice, remember, wine is 70 to 90% water. It concentrates the flavor and the structure, which may be seen as beneficial, but it also concentrates any potential faults. So you got to really be careful when you perform this enrichment to ensure that you're still achieving the best product possible. Conversely, we have acidification.
Mm-hmm. So this is generally going to be done in a region where you're probably experiencing more warm temperatures. So when you're growing grapes in warmer temperatures, the acid is generally going to be more prone to fall off depending on what the grape is and its resistance to warm temperatures. So if you're having a particularly low acid vintage, you may look to do acidification with tartaric acid, which helps you balance body, it raises your acidity, and gives your fruit to sugar ratio a little bit more balance with the addition of that acid. Sometimes, like I said, done in warm or hot climates, where vintage acid is not high enough. And much as though the chaptalization and enrichment have certain limits on where they cannot be done, the same can be said for acidification, because you'll see a lot in the old world that you have centuries old wine laws that just prohibit the human intervention where it isn't needed in wine. Particularly in France, I think we'll see that
we'll see that when we talk about
Italy,
France and Italy.
In Italy as well. So those really old and historic wine producing regions, they don't enjoy messing with their wine. So you also may have deacidification if your vintage is too high in acid. Say you had a particularly cold vintage. and you weren't looking for your wine to have that really, really high level of acid. So you may use an alkaline solution to de-acidify and lower the pH. So that brings us into fermentation itself.
Yeah, so alcoholic fermentation, it of course starts with your selection of yeast. So first off, the strain of wine yeast that is used to produce wine is called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and it is renowned by winemakers because it has the ability to stand up to the higher alcohol levels that wine typically sits at. However, this yeast will stop if it runs out of nutrients. If it runs out of sugar, or if it runs out of nutrients, it will stop and fall dormant. Again, more kind of yeast. We have ambient yeast. This is just ambient yeast that's in our air. Yeast is all around us. That we're taught that yeast is all around us, and it's in the air in the wineries. And as such, it is called the bloom or the winery yeast. And as such, you just let the natural air inoculate your grapes with yeast. However, while it may provide complexity due to the unique yeast in your winery, you may have unpredictable results because you cannot control what kinds of yeast are going into the wine. Finally, we have cultured yeast, which is added by the winemaker. It provides a flavor uniformity with predictable results. Yeast lives like us. It's alive, and as such, it has a certain temperature range that it likes.
So I was right when I said it before. Yeast are going to be existing no fewer than 5 degrees Celsius and no higher than around 35. But some, if they're particularly resistant, I believe can survive up to 38 degrees Celsius. And that's at the point where the yeast just go dormant, they stop working, they stop converting sugar into alcohol. So for all intents and purposes, they go dormant. And that's when you have something called gross lees and fine lees which we'll get into, I believe, in just a little bit. But touching on specific fermentation temperatures for white and red, you're going to be looking for a cooler fermentation for red, or rather whites, at around 12 to 22. And you'll want that because you're not worried about extracting the color and the tannins, whereas a higher temperature red wine fermentation at 20 to 32 is going to be looking to extract tannins, and that's tannins and color, and that happens at a higher temperature. So that's why you'll see this range in how our fermentation temperatures are going to be. So this also brings us into vessels, because you need to be able to have a vessel that can, one, keep a maintained temperature, or two, if you needed to, you might need it to fluctuate temperature. So James, what are some ways that we can, how can we store our wines and make sure that our fermentation is fairly consistent throughout?
So in order to keep consistency, we all know that wine is sometimes aged in oak, but I'd like to talk about our inert vessels. So vessels that don't really impart flavor. So we're getting more and more popularity. We're seeing a lot more popularity in concrete vessels. These are lined with like an epoxy resin so that they're waterproof. No wine can seep into the concrete. And one thing about the concrete is that it regulates temperature pretty much naturally. It's very low tech temperature regulation, but this comes at the cost of it being much harder to clean than, say, stainless steel, which is easy to clean. You can pretty much build a stainless steel container however big you may need. So it's very adaptable to the needs of your winery. And as such, the temperature can be controlled with sleeves that like kind of sit around the vat, where cold or warm water is circulated to adjust the temperature. So like I said, that concrete is low tech temperature regulation. Stainless steel would be much more high tech.
Mm-hmm. So those are some of our inert options, but classically we'll see a lot done in red wine production, where you're going to have oak aging or oak maturation. And this can be done in a couple different ways. You can either use French or American oak or European oak. It comes, I believe there's an oak production in some of Eastern Europe, but primarily France. You'll hear French oak a lot. And the real difference between French and American is French is going to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more pronounced in its barrel tannins that it's going to give you, while an American is going to have a little bit more sweetness, notes of perhaps more tropically coconut and vanilla notes, perhaps, and it's going to be a little bit more aromatic. So that's how you can tell your French versus American on a baseline level. What was also going to change the flavor complexity and the flavor characteristics of the barrel is going to be the level of toast that it undergoes. So the level of toast can vary, but toasting essentially transforms the wood. And the tannins and the flavor molecules inside the wood, it puts it through a process of, I can't think of any other word than transformation, that gives it that ability to impart sweetness and that ability to impart spice and flavor and vanilla and obviously toast. So James, let's talk about some different uses for age.
So the age of the barrel is also important when we consider storing wine. After 4 uses, the barrel imparts very little onto the wine. So there is the contrast between new and old oak. Newer oak obviously is going to impart more of the oaky flavors. You're going to get like smoke, vanilla into your wine, whereas older oak do not necessarily impart that as concentrated. We also need to take in consideration the size of the barrel. We have a large barrel. The wine is not going to have a lot of surface contact with the barrel, whereas if it's a smaller barrel, there will be more area for the wine to sit in contact with and develop those flavors. So ideally, if you would like to have the best oaked wine, quote unquote, would be a new small barrel to have the most concentrated flavors with the most surface area in contact with the wine. Mm-hmm. However, barrels can impart barrel tannins, they're called. And these are felt along your gums, whereas grape tannins sit on your tongue. And barrels are crazy expensive, so there's got to be some oak alternatives, right?
There are always alternatives, whether you want to go for something like an oak chip, which would be certainly, or maybe not certainly, you're generally not going to see that in premium wine production. You're going to see oak chips a lot in maybe large format wineries that are going to be looking to impart just a little bit of oak flavor at a very low cost. And they're essentially just an item that you steep in your wine, and then you either rack it into a new container or you strain out and filter the chips. A little bit more premium use of oak alternative would be an oak stave, which may in some ways have more benefits than an oak barrel, because you have full surface. Imagine this is my oak stave. You have surface contact with all the different sides, whereas if this was my barrel, I only have contact with what's on the inside, and then this outer contact is just nothing. It's just the rock.
All right, moving on, we're going to start talking about our white wine production. So we need to have some key options for fermentation. These are decisions that winemakers must make, whether or not they're going to have skin contact and produce what's called an orange wine. You got to ask yourself if you're going to clarify your wine. Again, you need to keep in mind the fermentation temperature of, again, around 12 to 22 degrees Celsius. For the white wine to preserve the fruitiness and primary characteristics of the wine. And again, like we just covered, the choice of vessel is very important, whether we have an inert vessel or a barrel, or the combination of the two.
Because blending is always an option. And we're going to run through this concept real quick. I'm sure we'll come back to it when we talk about further wine producing regions. We'll talk about malolactic fermentation, or MLF, MLC, or if you're talking about malolactic conversion, essentially talking about the same thing, the process of adding malolactic bacteria, which in essence consume malic acid in the wine, which is a higher acid, it's an acid molecule, and the bacteria converts it to lactic acid, the acid found in milk and butter and cheese and things of a dairy nature, which is a little bit softer and provides you with It also provides you with the sense of flavor, maybe notes of butter or hazelnuts, and also creates CO2 in the process. So this can reduce acidity in wine and add a feeling of roundness as well as that extra flavor. Then we'll get into lees, which is another way that you can impart a sort of roundness or richness to a wine. What are some flavor characteristics of a wine aged sur lie?
So wines aged surly, so on the lees in French, are going to have those very like bready flavors because it's sitting in contact with the yeast. So it's going to taste like bread, brioche, a lot of those kind of flavors. We mentioned the gros and the fine lees, gros being large in French. So the gros lees refers to the sediment of pooled lees at the bottom of the fermentation vessel. And you need to remove these. If not, it can produce very like unpleasant tastes and aromas in the wine. However, fine lees are the smaller particles that may settle slower than the bigger clumps, and they're often removed gradually through the winemaking process. Aging something surly, again, the winemakers may choose to keep the wine in contact with these fine lees for flavor and texture. When we have contact with the lees and the winemaker may choose to stir, which will agitate the yeast, allowing more surface contact with the wine, and that will add complexity, flavor, texture, and it will help reduce reductive compounds found in the wine.
Mhm. So that was a quick overview on white wine production. What we're going to just glance over for red wine production are what the major differences are. And you're going to see it's based a lot around extracting color and extracting tannins. So you could have pre-fermentation extraction, extraction during fermentation, or post-fermentation extraction. There are a lot of different ways that you are looking to extract tannins and structure from these grapes. So post-fermentation extraction could soften your tannins a little bit. Pre-fermentation extraction might be a cold soak, and extraction during fermentation is essentially just what happens during fermentation itself. You'll have the higher temperatures of the fermentation between 20 and 32 acting as a natural extractor of those tannins and colors. So you're going to have two options for fermentation and maturation. You're going to have your pre-bottling maturation with the options of either not maturing or maturing for a short or long period of time. A non-maturation wine might be done to preserve primary characteristics of, say, let's talk about
Red fruits, your strawberries, your cherries, your red currants.
Exactly. And then medium and long-term maturation could be done to add texture, complexity, things like that. I think we can glance over blending, since that's a pretty...
Well, why would we blend? We would blend because we would like to keep balance in the wine. Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot is often blended in Bordeaux to create balance between the two grapes. We would want consistency. From vintage to vintage, let's say Champagne would like to be very consistent from vintage to vintage. The big thing there is that they do blend. And like I mentioned earlier, juice can be different from the individual presses themselves. So coming back with the fractions of pressed wine, you would want to blend these different presses to have consistency across the vintage. Mm-hmm. Again, we do it for style, to add complexity, and also the price point as well.
All right, so different ways that you can stabilize and clarify your wine throughout this fermentation process, mostly towards the end. Sedimentation, which uses a gravitational approach, which just lets your gros lees and all your sediment collect at the bottom, which then you rack to a new container, leaving the sediment in your old container. You can fine, which is a chemical process of removing extremely fine particulate matter in the wine. Filtration, a more physical process, in which you could do a depth filtration, which is usually done first. It removes the more gritty and larger pieces of sediment and gros lees that are left, or you could stabilize, rather surface filtrate, which sort of looks at those fine lees and goes on a more fine mesh level to take those out. Stabilization, you can use tartrate, microbiological, or oxygen to stabilize your wine. Oxygen can, believe it or not, help keep wine fresher. Wine does need a little bit of oxygen in the wine itself, not necessarily in the bottle exposed to, but it does need a little bit of oxygen. And a tartrate you could chill and then filter out to remove tartrate crystals. You'll see those as like wine diamonds on the bottom of corks from time to time.
And factors to aging a wine, we've talked about it. You need complexity and you need the structure. You need high acid, high tannins. This is why often Cabernet Sauvignon or Bordeaux blends are aged for 40, 50 years because they can actually stand up to the long-term aging in bottle because of the high tannin, high acid, full body nature of the wine.
I think these 2 points are sort of not relevant to this section,
copy paste it somewhere else,
which is completely fine. We'll talk about them probably within the week.
Yeah.
But we're just going to touch on sweet wine production, and then I think we're just about wrapped up. This was a long one for you folks. 3 major ways that you can inhibit a wine from converting sugar to alcohol. You could stop fermentation, you could add a sweetener, or you could use a method to concentrate the grape sugars. If you're stopping fermentation, you could do this by adding sulfur dioxide. You could do it through freezing, or you could do it through fortification. Adding a sweetener like rectified concentrated grape must would be a natural way to sweeten, or you could use a German style sweetening method using the Süßreserve, which is
I don't know.
Süßreserve. Germans, let us know. Which is for unfermented grape juice used for the production of Cabernet or Spätlese. And James, what are some ways that we can concentrate grape sugars?
So there are a couple of big factors when we're concentrating grape sugars. We could have noble rot, which is botrytis. It's a fungus that infects the grape and dries it out through a chemical process. As such, you will see noble rot in areas that have cool, misty mornings and then have sunny and dry afternoons. Having a wine that is botrytized, meaning a wine that's been affected by noble rot, will have flavors of honey, apricot, or dried fruit. We're talking a lot about drying grapes, and we can straight up leave them on the vine through a process called passerellage. That is where the grapes are just left on the vine after the harvest season, and they are often labeled as late harvest. You can also dry the grapes after picking. You put them on mats and you dehydrate them, creating raisins pretty much that concentrate the sugars. This is often seen in passito wines from Italy, such as Recioto della Valpolicella. And finally, we can freeze the grapes in ice vine, if you're German.
I'm feeling German today.
And these grapes are left on the vine into the winter months, and they are frozen solid by the cold, and they are picked and quickly pressed to get an extremely concentrated, acidic and sweet wine.
Mm-hmm. So we'll see in this little diagram the 2 ways that red and white respectively converge and are the same. We'll see them converging in the youth wine section once they've both gone through their separate phases of crushing or destemming and fermentation and pressing, all the different stages. We'll see that fermentation and pressing are sort of flip-flopped for these 2, and then we always get to the same result of the end product of the wine. So that was a really brief overview of winemaking, red, white, and sweet. We might touch on rosé. We might lump it in when we talk about sparkling and fortified, since we missed it today. But real people, this has been real.
Yeah, keep it real, real people. We'll see you next time.